Some secrets are buried deep, hidden in places we never think to look. But what happens when life forces us to uncover them? When Evelyn lost her husband, James, she thought the worst was behind her. She believed she knew the man she had shared her life with. But grief has a way of unraveling the past, exposing truths we never imagined. And in her case, it all started with a barn, one James had always kept locked, a place she had never been allowed to enter. What was he hiding? And why had he worked so hard to keep it a secret? At first she hesitated. After all, some doors are closed for a reason, but something inside her whispered that she needed to look, that she had to know. And what she found inside changed everything. A hidden diary, a forgotten child, a past James had never shared. The life she thought she had known crumbled in an instant, replaced by a reality she never saw coming. But this wasn't just a revelation. It was a challenge. Her choice. Evelyn could turn away, leave the past buried, or she could step forward and face what James had left behind. But here's the thing. When we confront the truth, we don't just uncover secrets. We discover who we really are. What would you do if the person you loved had a hidden past? Would you walk away? Or would you fight to make things right? Evelyn's journey is about more than grief. It's about courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that goes beyond blood. And as she digs deeper, she realizes one thing. Some stories don't end with loss. Sometimes they're just beginning. The house was silent, yet the emptiness roared in Evelyn's ears. At 42, she had never imagined facing life without James, her husband of 15 years. It had been 40 days since he passed, and the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But for Evelyn, everything had. They had spent years trying to have a child, enduring treatments, false hopes, and crushing disappointments. Now, with James gone, the weight of that unfulfilled dream pressed down on her even harder. Every corner of their home was a reminder. His books still on the nightstand, his jacket draped over the chair, untouched since the day he left. The grief was relentless, suffocating, and she wondered if she would ever breathe freely again. Time had taken on a cruel nature, stretching endlessly as if mocking her loss. Every morning Evelyn would wake up expecting, for just a fleeting second, to hear James in the kitchen making his usual strong coffee. But the silence that followed was deafening. People told her to stay strong, to keep moving forward. But how could she when every fiber of her being was tied to the man she lost? Their home, their farm, everything they built together now felt like a relic of a past life. The responsibilities piled up, but the will to face them was absent. What was the point of pushing forward when the one person who made it all matter was no longer there? And yet, something inside her refused to completely surrender. She could still feel James in the air, in the walls of the house they had built together. He was always relentless, determined, never one to back down from a challenge. Perhaps that was why an odd thought began to form in her mind. There was one part of their home she had never truly set foot in, James's old barn, the one he always kept locked, the one he never let her enter. Evelyn had never questioned it before, trusting that whatever was inside was his business. But now, that locked barn felt like a riddle, a final piece of the puzzle he had left behind. And suddenly, the urge to uncover whatever he had hidden there became impossible to ignore. James had always been a man of quiet ambition. After years of running a successful business in the city, he made a bold decision. He sold everything and moved to the countryside with Evelyn. He wanted a simpler life, a place where they could build something lasting, something real. The farm became his new obsession, a project he poured himself into without hesitation. Even when his health started to decline, he refused to slow down. He worked from sunrise to sunset, pushing through the pain, determined to secure their future. Evelyn often urged him to rest, but he would simply smile and shake his head. He had a plan, one he never fully shared with her. Looking back, Evelyn realized how little she actually knew about the details of James's work in those last months. He had been more secretive than usual, spending long hours alone in the barn or making hushed phone calls she never overheard. When she questioned him, he dismissed her concerns with a reassuring kiss and a promise that everything he did was for them. And then, without warning, he was gone. His sudden passing left Evelyn not just grieving but confused. What had he been working so hard for? And why did he seem so desperate to finish it before his time ran out? There was something unfinished, something left behind. But what? The thought haunted her. James had always been a man of purpose, and he wouldn't have spent his last days toiling away for nothing. There had to be an answer somewhere, a clue to the mystery he never got the chance to explain. And suddenly the barn, the place he guarded so fiercely, felt even more significant. What was he hiding in there? Why had he never let her in? Evelyn felt a strange mix of anxiety and urgency building inside her. She needed to know, and whether she was ready for the truth or not, she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Evelyn stood at the entrance of the old barn, her heart pounding. The heavy wooden doors creaked as she pushed them open, revealing a space filled with dust, tools, and, oddly enough, an old wooden chest tucked away in the corner. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing something she never expected, a leather-bound journal with James's handwriting on the cover. It was his diary. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready to uncover the thoughts he had never shared with her. But curiosity, mixed with the lingering weight of unanswered questions, pushed her forward. As she flipped through the pages, her breath caught in her throat. This was not just a record of his work, this was a confession. Page after page, James revealed a past Evelyn had never known. Years before they met, he'd been in love with another woman, Elizabeth. Their relationship had ended badly, but not before something life-changing had happened. James had fathered a child. Shock turned to disbelief as Evelyn read on. Elizabeth, unwilling to take on the responsibility of raising the boy, had abandoned him in an orphanage. James had never stopped feeling guilty about it. He had tried to find the child, but Elizabeth had cut off all contact, refusing to reveal where she had left him. It was a secret James had carried for years, one that had eaten away at him in silence. Evelyn's mind swirled with emotions, pain, anger, confusion. How could he have kept this from her? All those years of dreaming about having a family, of struggling with infertility, and yet, somewhere out there, James had a son, and worse, a son who had been left to grow up alone. But as the initial shock faded, a new feeling emerged. James's last days had been filled with urgency. Was this what he had been working toward? Had he been trying to right his past mistakes before it was too late? And if so, what had he planned to do? Evelyn knew one thing for certain: she couldn't stop now. The truth was out, but the story wasn't over. Evelyn sat frozen, the weight of James's words pressing down on her. She had spent years believing she knew everything about the man she loved, yet here was proof that he had carried an unbearable secret all along. But as shocking as it was to learn about the existence of his child, what truly made her stomach twist was what came next in the journal. Elizabeth had not just abandoned their son, she had done so knowing he was sick, a fragile child, left behind because she saw him as nothing more than a burden. James had never forgiven himself for failing to protect the boy, and in those final months, he had been desperately trying to find him. Evelyn gritted her teeth, anger rising like a flame inside her. How could a mother walk away from her own child? And worse, from one who needed her the most? The thought made her sick. But at the same time, she felt a painful understanding of why James had hidden this from her. He knew how much she had longed for a child, how much heartbreak they had endured together. Maybe he had been afraid that the truth would break her, or maybe he had simply run out of time before he could tell her everything. Either way, there was no denying it now. This child, James's child, was out there somewhere, possibly still suffering, possibly still waiting for someone to care. And then a thought struck her. What if James had already found him? What if that was what he had been working toward in those final months? Evelyn flipped desperately through the remaining pages of the journal, searching for an answer. She could feel it, just beyond her grasp, like a puzzle missing its final piece. If James had uncovered the child's whereabouts, there had to be a record of it somewhere, and if that were true, there was only one thing left for her to do: find him. Evelyn couldn't sleep that night. Her mind kept circling back to the journal, to the pages filled with James's guilt and regret. But more than anything, her thoughts kept returning to the boy. She didn't know his name, his face, or where he was now, but she knew one thing: If James had spent his final days searching for him, then she would finish what he started. The next morning, she began digging through every document James had left behind. Bills, letters, even old receipts, anything that might give her a clue. And then she found it. A single folded piece of paper tucked inside a locked drawer of his desk. An address. Her hands shook as she unfolded the note, staring at the name scribbled at the top. Philip. That was his name. And beneath it, the address of a children's home in a neighboring town. A rush of emotions hit her all at once. Relief that she had a lead. Fear of what she would find. But most of all, an overwhelming sense of duty. This was James's son, and in some strange way she felt like he was already a part of her life too. Without another thought, she grabbed her coat and keys and drove to the address, her heart pounding harder with every mile. But when she arrived, the reality was harsher than she expected. Philip was still at the orphanage, but his condition was worse than she imagined. He was small for his age, frail, his eyes carrying the kind of weariness no child should ever have to bear. The caretakers explained that he had a serious medical condition that required expensive treatment, something the orphanage simply couldn't afford. Evelyn felt the weight of the decision before her. Taking him in wouldn't just be a matter of signing papers, it would mean fighting for his life. And despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she knew her choice was already made. She would bring him home, no matter what it took. Evelyn had made up her mind, but reality quickly set in. Adopting Philip wasn't going to be easy. The process was complex, the costs overwhelming, and time was working against her. The orphanage was barely managing to care for him, and his condition was worsening. She had some savings, but it wasn't enough to cover the treatments he needed. Worse, when she confided in her mother, hoping for support, she was met with resistance. "I barely know this boy," her mother said, shaking her head. "You've lost so much already, Evelyn. Don't make this harder on yourself." But Evelyn couldn't turn back now. She saw something in Philip, an unspoken connection, as if James had left him behind for her to find. When all seemed hopeless, unexpected help came from the last place she expected, James's parents. She had been distant from them after his death, not knowing how to face them in her grief. But when they learned the truth, they didn't hesitate. "James would have wanted this," his father said, pressing a check into her hands. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was a start. Her mother, who had been so skeptical at first, softened when she saw Philip for the first time. He was weak, but his eyes, those deep, searching eyes, held something familiar. Something that reminded her of James. Slowly, resistance turned into quiet support, and for the first time Evelyn felt like she wasn't fighting this battle alone. And then came the biggest surprise of all. While clearing out more of James's things, Evelyn stumbled upon something hidden beneath the floorboards of their bedroom, a small locked box. Inside she found what could only be described as a treasure. Not gold or jewels, but something just as valuable. Documents, investments, and a significant amount of money James had been saving. She couldn't believe it. He had been planning for something, maybe even this, and just like that, the impossible suddenly seemed within reach. Philip would get his treatment. He would have a home. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like James was still guiding her, leading her exactly where she needed to be. Just when Evelyn thought things were finally settling, a storm she never saw coming arrived at her doorstep. Elizabeth. After all these years, after abandoning her own child, she had suddenly reappeared. And worse, she wasn't just there to stir up trouble. She wanted Philip back. "He's not James's son," she declared, her voice laced with cold confidence. "You have no right to keep him." The words hit Evelyn like a punch. After everything, after fighting so hard to give Philip a chance at a better life, Elizabeth was trying to take him away. But why now? Why, after all this time, was she suddenly interested in a boy she had once discarded like an afterthought? Evelyn knew there had to be more to it. People like Elizabeth didn't just show up out of the goodness of their hearts. And soon enough, the truth revealed itself. She wasn't here for Philip. She was after something else. Money. She had somehow learned about James's hidden assets, the inheritance Evelyn had found, and now she saw Philip as her golden ticket. If she could prove she was his mother, she could claim a fortune. Evelyn felt the anger rising in her chest. This woman had left Philip behind when he needed her the most, and now she had the audacity to act like she cared. No, she wouldn't let this happen. But Elizabeth was prepared for a fight. She demanded a DNA test, and when the results came back, the truth shook Evelyn to her core. Philip wasn't James's biological son. Everything she had believed about him, about their connection, was turned upside down in an instant. But instead of doubt, a new conviction settled in her heart. Philip may not have been tied to James by blood, but that didn't change what truly mattered. He was hers now, and no DNA test would tell her otherwise. But with Elizabeth threatening legal action, Evelyn realized she would have to fight harder than ever to protect the boy she had come to love as her own. Elizabeth thought the DNA results would give her the upper hand, but she had underestimated Evelyn's resolve. Blood didn't define family, love did. And Evelyn wasn't about to let a greedy, manipulative woman walk back into Philip's life just to use him as a pawn. But the legal battle ahead was daunting. Elizabeth had hired a lawyer, determined to regain custody and claim any financial benefits tied to Philip's adoption. The case quickly became a war, with Evelyn fighting not just for her right to keep Philip, but for his safety and future. She knew what would happen if he was taken away. He would end up in the hands of a woman who had never wanted him in the first place. But then the tables turned. As the case gained attention, more details about Elizabeth's past began to surface. Investigators dug into her records, uncovering a long trail of fraud, deceit, and even neglect in previous relationships. The woman who had so confidently walked into Evelyn's life, demanding her rights, was now facing criminal charges. And just like that, her entire case crumbled. The judge ruled in Evelyn's favor, granting her full legal custody of Philip. The moment the verdict was announced, relief washed over her. She had won, not just for herself, but for Philip. He was finally safe, free from the woman who had abandoned him. But the true victory wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the quiet moments afterward. That night, as Evelyn tucked Philip into bed, he looked up at her with innocent, tired eyes and whispered, "Am I really yours now?" She smiled, holding back tears, and brushed a hand through his hair. "You've always been mine," she said softly. And at that moment, she knew that nothing, not DNA, not court battles, not the ghosts of the past, would ever change that. But even with Elizabeth out of the picture, Evelyn wasn't finished yet. There was still a future to build, a life to create, and for the first time in a long time she felt ready to move forward. With the storm behind them, Evelyn finally felt like she could breathe again. Life on the farm no longer felt like a place frozen in time. It was now a home filled with laughter, warmth, and the sounds of Philip running through the fields. She poured her energy into making the farm thrive, just as James once had. At first it was a struggle. She had never fully taken the reins of the business before, but she learned quickly, making adjustments that helped the farm become more profitable than ever. Neighbors who once saw her as just James's widow now respected her as a hard-working farm owner. And through it all, Philip was by her side, growing stronger every day. But something unexpected happened along the way. As time passed, Evelyn realized that her heart had room for more. Philip had once been a lost child in need of a home, and now she couldn't ignore the thought that there were others like him. Children abandoned, forgotten, just waiting for someone to take a chance on them. It started with one, then another, and before she knew it, her home was no longer just a farm but a sanctuary. A place where children who had nowhere else to go found safety, love, and a fresh start. Each one had a story, a struggle, but in Evelyn's home they weren't defined by their past. They were given the chance to build a future. The farm that once symbolized her pain had now become her greatest purpose. What had started as a painful journey of loss had turned into something far greater than she ever imagined. Philip, once a fragile boy with no one to fight for him, was now a strong, happy child, no longer just an orphan, but a brother to those who had come after him. And Evelyn? She was no longer the grieving widow she once was. She had found her calling, a life that, in many ways, James had unknowingly set in motion. But the journey wasn't over yet. There was still more to do, more lives to change, and in her heart she knew that James would have been proud. Years had passed, but Evelyn still found herself reflecting on the path that had led her here. Sitting on the farmhouse porch, she watched as Philip, now nearly a grown young man, helped the younger children feed the animals. He had grown into a kind, responsible boy, and though he had long since learned the truth about his past, it had never changed how he saw his family. He wasn't just a child who had been taken in. He was a son, a brother, and a part of something bigger than himself. One day he had finally asked the question Evelyn had known was coming. "Why did you choose me?" She had smiled, pulling him close. "Because love isn't about who we're born to," she had said. "It's about who we choose." That truth had guided Evelyn through every step of her journey. She had built something she never imagined for herself, something greater than just a farm or a business. Her home had become a place of second chances, a living testament to James's memory. And though she still missed him, she no longer felt the aching sadness that had once consumed her. Instead, she felt gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had shared, for the lessons he had unknowingly left behind, and for the new life she had been brave enough to build. She knew now that grief didn't mean the end of happiness. It was simply the beginning of a different kind of life, one shaped by the strength to keep moving forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the moment settle in her chest. Philip turned to her, his smile full of quiet understanding. He knew what this place meant to her, what it had come to represent. "We're lucky, aren't we?" he said softly. Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "More than we'll ever know." Life had taken unexpected turns, tested her in ways she never could have imagined. But in the end, she had found exactly what she had always longed for: a family, a purpose, and a love that, even after all these years, still guided her forward. Life has a way of testing us, pushing us into places we never expected to go. Evelyn never thought she would raise a child that wasn't her own, never imagined she would build a family out of broken pieces. But here's the truth. Family isn't about DNA. It's about love, about choosing to stand by someone even when the world says you don't have to. And in the end, that choice is what defines us. So let me ask you, how many opportunities have you ignored because they didn't come in the form you expected? How often do we close the door to something that could change our lives just because it scares us? Evelyn's story is a reminder that sometimes what we're looking for isn't what we planned. It's what finds us when we're brave enough to open the right doors. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for life to hand you the perfect moment. Maybe the right moment is already here, waiting for you to step forward and claim it. Think about it. What's one decision you could make today that might change everything for you? And more importantly, will you take it? If you've been inspired by this story, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. There are more lessons to be learned, more journeys to take. And who knows, the next story might just be the one that changes your life.